You know that moment when someone casually asks what you're interested in, and you hesitate for a second, because the honest answer sounds strangely complicated. You start listing things, maybe design, maybe psychology, maybe writing, or coding, or learning about history, or some random topic you fell into at 2 in the morning last week. And somewhere in the middle of that explanation, you can almost feel the other person becoming slightly confused, as if there were an invisible rule you were supposed to follow. One interest, one path, one clear identity. For a long time, people with too many interests have quietly carried a small sense of suspicion about themselves, a feeling that maybe something about their attention is scattered. Maybe they just can't commit. Maybe they lack discipline. At least, that's the story they often hear. School systems tend to reward people who pick one subject and stay inside it. Career advice usually sounds the same. Choose a lane, focus, go deeper. And when someone keeps wandering between different subjects, it can look unfocused from the outside. But people who live inside this pattern often know it doesn't feel like distraction. It feels more like curiosity, pulling them in many directions at once. One interest lights up, then another appears somewhere nearby, and suddenly the mind is moving across entirely different ideas. For some people, this becomes a quiet cycle. They dive deeply into something new. They read about it, watch videos, collect notes, experiment with it for weeks or months. And then one day, the fascination softens, and something else captures their attention instead. From the outside, this can look like abandoning things, but internally, it often feels more like finishing a chapter. Many people who experience this pattern notice a small moment of hesitation when someone asks about their career path, because the truthful answer rarely fits inside one word, and sometimes they even simplify their answer, just to avoid the long explanation. If you've ever noticed yourself doing this, you're definitely not alone. And if you enjoy exploring these quiet patterns of human psychology, subscribing to the channel helps more people discover these insights. What's interesting is that psychology has started to notice this pattern more carefully. For a long time, the world mostly celebrated a certain type of expertise, a person who spends decades mastering one narrow field. That kind of depth is incredibly valuable, but it also shaped the assumption that depth must always look like a straight vertical line. One subject, one specialization, one long path. But human minds don't all organize themselves that way. Some people develop what researchers sometimes describe as a multi-spike pattern of learning. Instead of one deep pillar of knowledge, their abilities form several deep areas connected by a wide network of curiosity. Imagine the letter M, two strong pillars of depth, and between them, a horizontal bridge of interests, ideas, and perspectives. People with this pattern often build one area of competence first, something practical, a skill that becomes stable enough to rely on. But their curiosity rarely stops there, because once the mind understands one system deeply, it begins to notice patterns in other systems too. And that's where something unusual begins to happen. A designer who studies psychology suddenly sees how emotions influence the way people interact with technology. A programmer who reads about storytelling starts noticing how narrative structure resembles software architecture. A musician who learns mathematics begins recognizing the quiet geometry inside rhythm. At first, these connections seem random, but over time, they create a different kind of intelligence, not just depth, but synthesis. Some people experience this when they read something in one field and suddenly feel it explaining something completely unrelated, almost like two distant ideas quietly recognize each other. That moment can feel strangely satisfying, like pieces of a puzzle snapping together. And people with many interests often collect hundreds of these small connections over time. Another thing they sometimes notice is a habit of storing information that seems unrelated to anything they're currently doing. They might keep notes about architecture even if they work in software, or read about neuroscience even if their job has nothing to do with research. At the time, it often feels like intellectual wandering. But months or years later, one of those old ideas suddenly becomes useful in a completely different context. This ability has a name in psychology. It's called far transfer. It describes the mind's ability to take a pattern learned in one domain and apply it somewhere completely different. Most expertise relies on near transfer, applying the same knowledge to similar problems. But far transfer works differently. It relies on crossing boundaries between fields, and people with many interests spend years unknowingly building the raw material for that process. Of course, there's also a quiet cost to this way of thinking, because it means repeatedly becoming a beginner. Every new interest starts with uncertainty again. New terminology, new mistakes, new confusion. Some people even experience a small sense of guilt when their curiosity moves on to something new, as if leaving an interest behind means they failed to commit. But in many cases, the brain wasn't abandoning the subject. It was simply extracting what it needed from it. Another mirror moment appears here. Some people suddenly realize that knowledge from an old interest keeps reappearing in unexpected places. Something they learned years ago quietly surfaces and solves a problem they're facing today. And for a moment, the scattered path starts to look less random, more like a long network of connections. Interestingly, the modern world is becoming more unpredictable than the systems many careers were built for. Technologies change quickly, entire industries shift. New roles appear that didn't exist a decade earlier. In these environments, the ability to connect ideas from multiple fields becomes increasingly valuable. Because complex problems rarely belong to only one discipline. They sit somewhere in between, at the intersection of technology and human behavior, or design and psychology, or science and communication. People who naturally explore different subjects often end up standing exactly at those intersections, not because they planned it, but because curiosity kept leading them there. This doesn't mean having many interests is better than deep specialization. Both patterns of thinking are essential. One goes deeper, the other connects wider. They simply solve different kinds of problems. But for someone who has spent years feeling scattered, it can be strangely relieving to realize something. Their mind might not be unfocused. It might simply be structured differently. Instead of building a single tower of knowledge, it builds several smaller towers connected by bridges. And those bridges sometimes become the place where the most interesting ideas appear. So the next time someone asks what you're interested in, and the answer feels slightly complicated, it may not mean your direction is unclear. It may simply mean your mind is still collecting pieces that might not look connected today, but often reveal their purpose much later. There are many quiet patterns like this hidden inside human behavior, and sometimes the things we once considered distractions turn out to be the exact traits that allow us to see connections other people miss.